March 17, 1977. San Juan, Puerto Rico. The Roberto Clemente Coliseum was packed with 10,000 screaming fans, watching George Foreman lose a fight he should have won. But nobody in that arena, not the fans, not the commentators, not even Foreman himself, knew that in about 30 minutes, George Foreman was going to die. And what happened when he died would change boxing history forever. Because the man who walked into that dressing room was a fighter. The man who walked out was a preacher. And the voice he heard in between those two moments came from somewhere nobody expected. George Foreman was 28 years old and at a crossroads. 3 years earlier, he'd been the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, a terrifying force who demolished Joe Frazier in 2 rounds to win the title. Then Muhammad Ali took everything away in Zaire with the Rumble in the Jungle, using his rope-a-dope strategy to wear Foreman out before knocking him out in the 8th round. The loss had broken something inside Foreman. Not his body. His body was still strong, still powerful, still capable of destroying any man who stood in front of him. But his spirit, his confidence, his belief that he was invincible, Ali had shattered all of that in one October night in 1974. Now, nearly 3 years later, Foreman was trying to claw his way back to a title shot. He'd won 5 straight fights since the Ali loss, all by knockout. But to get back to the championship, he needed to beat Jimmy Young, a slick boxer with a 25 record who most people thought would be an easy win for Foreman. Most people were wrong. From the opening bell, nothing went right for George Foreman that night. The heat in Puerto Rico was suffocating. The arena had no air conditioning, and the temperature inside was over 100 degrees. The humidity made it feel like boxing inside a sauna. Foreman had flown in just 1 day before the fight without giving himself time to adjust to the climate. It was a mistake that would nearly cost him his life. Jimmy Young was doing exactly what Ali had done. Move, jab, clinch, make Foreman chase him, make Foreman work, make Foreman burn energy in the oppressive heat. And it was working. By the 3rd round, Foreman was already breathing hard. By the 5th round, his punches had lost their snap. By the 7th round, he could barely lift his arms. Young landed a hard right hand in round 7 that hurt Foreman badly. For a moment, it looked like the fight might be stopped. But Foreman survived, stumbling back to his corner on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. His trainer, Gil Clancy, was shouting instructions that Foreman couldn't process. The words came to him like they were underwater, distorted, meaningless. "George, you gotta get inside. Stop chasing him. Cut off the ring." But Foreman couldn't cut off anything. He could barely see. The ring lights were too bright, burning his eyes. Or maybe they weren't bright enough. Everything was starting to go dark around the edges. In round 12, Jimmy Young knocked George Foreman down. It was a left hook that Foreman never saw coming, a punch that sent him to the canvas for only the 2nd time in his professional career. The first time had been against Ali, now Young. Foreman got up before the referee could even start counting, more from pride than from consciousness. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know what round it was. He just knew he had to keep fighting. The final bell rang after 12 rounds. Jimmy Young had won a clear, unanimous decision. The judges had it 117-112, 116-112, and 115-114, all for Young. George Foreman had lost his 2nd professional fight. More importantly, he'd lost his chance at an immediate title shot. He'd have to start over, win more fights, prove himself all over again. But none of that mattered, because George Foreman wasn't thinking about his next fight. He was thinking about water. He needed water. He was so thirsty he couldn't think straight. When had he last had water? During the fight? Before the fight? He couldn't remember. Foreman's corner team helped him out of the ring and back to the dressing room. His legs weren't working right. He kept stumbling, kept leaning on his trainer, kept trying to make his body do things it wouldn't do. "I'm okay," Foreman kept saying. "I'm fine. Just need some water. Just need to cool down." But he wasn't fine. Something was very wrong. Inside the dressing room, they sat Foreman down on the rub-down table. The doctor came in to check on him, standard procedure after a fight. "How you feeling, champ?" the doctor asked. "Hot," Foreman said. "So hot and thirsty. Can I get some water?" They gave him water. He drank it so fast he choked.
They gave him more. He drank that too. But the water didn't help. Nothing helped.
The heat inside him wasn't going away. Foreman lay back on the table, staring at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights were too bright. He closed his eyes. That was when he started talking to himself, out loud. "I don't care about this fight," Foreman said to no one in particular. "I don't care that I lost. I'm still George Foreman. I'm still rich. I'm still famous. I can fight again next month, or I can go make movies. I got money in the bank. I got cars. I got houses. I can retire right now if I want. I can go home and just die." The words slipped into his monologue without him planning it. Die. Where had that come from? "Yeah, I could just die," Foreman said again. "Just go home and die." And then he couldn't stop saying it. Die. Die. I could die. I'm going to die. I'm dying. I'm dying right now. His corner team exchanged worried glances. "George, you're okay," Gil Clancy said, trying to sound reassuring, but not quite managing it. "You just got beat up a little. You're dehydrated. The doc's gonna check you out." But Foreman wasn't listening. He was somewhere else now, somewhere dark. He could feel it pulling at him, something cold and empty reaching up from beneath the rub-down table, wrapping around his chest, squeezing. "I'm dying," Foreman said, his voice rising in panic. "I'm dying right now. I can feel it. Something's wrong. Something's really wrong." The doctor leaned over him, checking his pulse, looking into his eyes with a small flashlight. "Your heart rate's elevated, George. You're showing signs of heat exhaustion, maybe heat stroke. We need to cool you down. We need to get some fluids in you." They put ice packs on Foreman's neck, under his arms, on his forehead. They elevated his feet. They kept giving him water, but nothing worked. The darkness kept spreading. George Foreman could feel himself dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. And then came the voice. It wasn't a voice from the room. It wasn't one of his trainers, or the doctor, or anyone physically present. This voice came from inside his head, or maybe from somewhere deeper than that. From somewhere beyond himself. "You believe in God," the voice said. "Why are you afraid to die?" The question hit Foreman like a punch he couldn't block. He did believe in God. He'd been raised in church. His mother had taken him to services every Sunday when he was a kid. He knew about God, knew about Jesus, knew about heaven and hell. But knowing about God and actually believing, actually having faith, those were two different things. "I'm afraid," Foreman said out loud, answering the voice. "I don't want to die. I'm not ready." "But you're dying anyway," the voice said. And it was true. Foreman could feel his life slipping away. His heart was beating too fast, then too slow, then not at all. Or maybe it was still beating, and he just couldn't feel it anymore. He couldn't feel anything anymore, except the darkness pulling him down, down, down. And then George Foreman died. His eyes were still open. His body was still on the table in the dressing room in Puerto Rico. But George Foreman, the consciousness, the soul, the essential part of him that made him who he was, that part left his body. Later, when Foreman tried to describe what happened next, he struggled to find words adequate to the experience. How do you describe dying to someone who's never done it? How do you make them understand what it feels like to stop existing? "I was in nothing," Foreman would say years later. "Above me, below me, all around me, just nothing. The darkest dark you can imagine, the emptiest empty. I was in a place where hope didn't exist because nothing existed. I was in hell." The realization came to Foreman with absolute clarity. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination from heat stroke or dehydration. This was real. He was dead, and he was in hell. There were no flames, no demons, no physical torture, just nothing. Infinite, eternal nothing. And somehow that was worse than any fire could have been, because at least fire is something. This was the absence of everything. The absence of love, of light, of hope, of God. Just void, forever. Foreman tried to scream, but he had no voice. He tried to move, but he had no body. He was just consciousness trapped in nothing. And he knew, with terrible certainty, that this was forever. This was eternity.
This was what came after life, when you lived for yourself, when you spent your whole life angry and proud, and convinced that you didn't need anyone, not even God.
How long have I been here? Foreman thought. Had it been seconds? Hours? Years? There was no time in this place. Just endless now, stretching in all directions, never changing, never ending. And then, from somewhere in that vast nothing, George Foreman found something he didn't know he still had. Faith. Not the kind of faith he'd been raised with, the Sunday morning church faith that was more habit than belief. Real faith. Desperate, grasping, last chance faith.
The kind of faith that comes when you have absolutely nothing left to lose because you've already lost everything, including your life. "I don't care if this is death," Foreman screamed into the void, not with his voice because he had no voice, but with his whole being. "I still believe there's a God. I still believe. Do you hear me? I still believe."
And then everything changed. A hand, massive and powerful, and somehow impossibly gentle, reached down into the darkness. Foreman couldn't see it, not with eyes, because he had no eyes in this place, but he could feel it. Light and warmth and love, everything the void wasn't, reaching down, reaching for him. The hand grabbed him and pulled, up, out, away from the nothing, away from the darkness, away from hell itself. And George Foreman came back to life. He gasped, a huge, desperate breath like a drowning man breaking the surface. His eyes, which had been open but seeing nothing, suddenly focused. He was back in the dressing room in Puerto Rico, back in his body, back in the world. But he was not the same man who had died.
Foreman jumped off the table. His legs, which minutes ago couldn't support his weight, now moved with manic energy. He started hugging everyone in the room, his trainers, his manager, the doctor, the cut man, everyone. "I love you," he told each person. "I love you so much. Jesus loves you. God loves you. We're all loved. Do you understand? We're all saved." They thought he'd lost his mind. Heat stroke, they figured, or a concussion, or maybe the stress of losing had broken something in his brain. Famous people had breakdowns all the time. They tried to calm him down, tried to get him to sit back down on the table, tried to get the doctor to give him something to help him relax. But George Foreman wasn't having a breakdown. He was having a breakthrough. Everything that had defined his life up to that moment, the anger, the pride, the violence, the need to dominate, it was all gone, burned away in that moment of death and rebirth. He'd gone to hell and come back, and you don't come back from hell the same person who went in. The doctor wanted to take Foreman to the hospital, standard procedure after a fighter shows signs of heat stroke and starts acting erratically. But Foreman refused. "I don't need a hospital," he said, calmer now, but still radiating an intensity that made everyone nervous. "I need to get out of here. I need to go tell people what happened. I need to tell them about Jesus." They finally got Foreman back to his hotel room, though it took 4 people to keep him from running out into the streets of San Juan to start preaching right then and there. In his room, Foreman couldn't stop talking about what he'd experienced. "I was dead," he kept saying. "I was really, actually dead, and I saw hell. Not fire and demons like in the movies, just nothing, just emptiness forever. And I absolutely knew that was where I was going to be for eternity. But then I called out to God, and He heard me. He reached down and He saved me. He pulled me out of nothing, and He brought me back, and He put Jesus in my heart." His manager, sitting in the hotel room trying to process what he was hearing, asked the obvious question. "George, you just lost a big fight. Your career's in trouble. You need to train. You need to win some fights. You need to get back in title contention. What are you talking about, Jesus and hell? You got hit too hard, that's all. Get some sleep. You'll feel better in the morning." But Foreman shook his head. "I'm never boxing again," he said simply. "What?" His manager stood up. "George, you can't be serious. Boxing is your life. It's who you are."
"No," Foreman said firmly. "Boxing was my life. Violence was who I was. Anger was what I knew. But that man died tonight in that dressing room. I'm someone different now."
I'm someone who knows what hell looks like and what God feels like, and I can't go back to hurting people for money. I won't.
The next morning, George Foreman woke up in his hotel room in Puerto Rico and for a brief moment wondered if the whole thing had been a dream. The death, the darkness, the voice, the hand pulling him back, had any of it really happened? Then he looked at his hands and saw dried blood on his knuckles from the fight. He looked at his face in the mirror and saw the swelling, the cuts, the evidence of 12 hard rounds with Jimmy Young. The fight had been real, which meant everything that came after was real too.
Foreman called his mother that morning. Nancy Foreman had raised her son in the church, had prayed for him every day of his life, had watched him become famous and wealthy and violent, and had never stopped believing that one day God would reach him. "Mama," George said when she answered, his voice thick with emotion, "something happened to me last night." "I know, baby," his mother said. "I saw the fight on television. I'm sorry you lost." "I'm not talking about the fight, Mama. I'm talking about after. I died last night. I really died, and I went to hell. And God saved me. Jesus brought me back." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then his mother started crying. "Thank you, Jesus," she whispered. "Thank you."
I've been praying for this for 28 years. Within a week, George Foreman had returned to Houston and announced his retirement from boxing. The press conference was bizarre. Reporters came expecting to hear about Foreman's plans to rebuild his career after the Jimmy Young loss. Instead, they heard a man talking about near-death experiences and divine intervention and becoming a minister. "Are you saying you had a religious experience?" one reporter asked, skepticism dripping from every word. "I'm saying I died and God brought me back to life," Foreman replied calmly. "I'm saying I saw hell and I'm never going back. I'm saying Jesus Christ saved my soul, and now I'm going to spend the rest of my life serving him." The reporters looked at each other.
This was the same George Foreman who'd been called the most frightening fighter in boxing, the same man who'd demolished Joe Frazier, the same intimidating presence who'd made grown men afraid. And now he was talking about Jesus like a street preacher. The boxing world didn't know what to make of it. Some thought it was a publicity stunt. Others thought Foreman had suffered brain damage from too many punches. Still others thought he was having a mental breakdown and would return to boxing within months once he came to his senses. But George Foreman was serious. He enrolled in seminary. He studied theology. He began preaching on street corners in Houston's Fifth Ward, the same rough neighborhood where he'd grown up. He stood on corners where drug dealers worked and prostitutes walked, and told anyone who would listen about the night he died and came back. Most people walked past him. Some laughed. A few stopped to listen. Foreman didn't care. He'd seen hell.
He'd experienced the absence of God, and now that he knew what that felt like, he couldn't stop talking about it. His wife at the time didn't understand what had happened to her husband. The George Foreman she'd married was proud, strong, confident, always in control. This new George was humble, gentle, talking constantly about serving others and spreading the gospel. "Who are you?" she asked him one night. "What happened to the man I married?" "He died," Foreman said simply, "in a dressing room in Puerto Rico. This is who I am now." The marriage didn't survive his transformation. They divorced within a year. Foreman's boxing friends drifted away. His business associates moved on to other fighters. The endorsement deals dried up. For most people, that kind of isolation would be devastating, but Foreman felt freer than he'd ever been in his life. In 1978, George Foreman was ordained as a minister. He founded the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ in Houston, a small congregation that met in a rented space. At first, only a handful of people attended his services, but Foreman preached with the same intensity he'd once brought to boxing. He talked about his own journey from violence to faith, from pride to humility, from death to life. And slowly, people started listening. His sermons weren't polished or eloquent. Foreman hadn't been to prestigious seminaries or studied under famous theologians. But what he lacked in training, he made up for in authenticity. When he talked about God pulling him out of darkness, everyone in that room knew he was talking about something real.
You couldn't fake the kind of conviction in Foreman's voice when he preached.
By 1980, Foreman had opened the George Foreman Youth and Community Center in Houston. He sold 2 homes and his ranch to fund it. The center was his way of giving back to the neighborhood that had shaped him, the Fifth Ward, where poverty and violence trapped kids the same way it had trapped him decades earlier. The center offered after-school programs, boxing training, computer classes, and most importantly, a safe place for kids to go. Foreman was there every day, not as a celebrity or a former champion, but as a mentor and father figure to dozens of kids who had none. But by 1987, the center was in trouble. Foreman had poured everything he had into it, but keeping the doors open required constant funding. Donations weren't enough.
His savings were nearly gone. He faced a choice: close the center or find a way to raise serious money quickly.
That's when George Foreman made the decision that shocked the world. He announced he was returning to boxing. 10 years after his spiritual transformation, 10 years after swearing he'd never fight again, 10 years after dying in that Puerto Rico dressing room, George Foreman was going back to the ring. The announcement was met with almost universal mockery. Foreman was 38 years old, ancient by boxing standards. He'd been retired for a decade. He'd gained weight, ballooning to nearly 300 pounds while running his church and youth center. And he was going to fight professional heavyweights? The media called it a joke, a publicity stunt, a sad attempt by a former champion to recapture past glory. But they didn't understand.
Foreman wasn't coming back for glory. He was coming back for the kids. "I'm not the same man who left boxing in 1977, Foreman told reporters. That man was angry and violent and fought to hurt people. This man is fighting to help people. Every dollar I make goes to keeping the youth center open. I'm not fighting for myself anymore. I'm fighting for them." On March 9, 1987, George Foreman stepped into a boxing ring for the first time in 10 years. His opponent was Steve Zuski, a journeyman fighter with a 15-10 record. Foreman weighed 267 pounds, nearly 50 pounds heavier than he'd been in his prime. He looked slow and old and completely out of place. Then the bell rang. Foreman walked forward like a bulldozer, threw a few short punches, and knocked Zuski out in 4 rounds. The power was still there. That devastating right hand that had destroyed Joe Frazier, that had terrorized the heavyweight division, it hadn't gone anywhere.
Over the next 7 years, George Foreman went 24-0 in his comeback, with 22 knockouts. But this wasn't the same George Foreman who'd fought in the 1970s. That Foreman had been sullen and intimidating, glaring at opponents, trying to scare them before the first punch was thrown. This Foreman smiled, he joked, he told stories. He was friendly and warm and seemed to genuinely enjoy being in the ring again. Between rounds, instead of glaring across the ring at his opponent, he'd chat with the referee. After knocking someone out, he'd help them up and make sure they were okay. The transformation was so complete that fans who'd been terrified of George Foreman in the 1970s now loved him in the 1990s.
He'd become one of the most popular figures in sports.
But behind the smiles and the jokes, George Foreman never forgot why he was fighting. Every time he stepped into the ring, he remembered the kids at the youth center. Every time he trained, running in the early morning hours when his body screamed at him to quit, he thought about the children who needed a safe place to go. Every time doubt crept in, when he wondered if he was too old or too slow or too far past his prime, he remembered that night in Puerto Rico when he died and God had given him a second chance. This comeback wasn't about him. It was about purpose. It was about using his gifts to serve others. It was about living out the faith that had saved his life.
In 1991, Foreman got his first title shot of the comeback, fighting Evander Holyfield for the undisputed heavyweight championship. Foreman was 42 years old. Holyfield was 28, in his absolute prime, undefeated as a heavyweight. Every expert picked Holyfield to destroy the old man. For 12 rounds, George Foreman proved them wrong. He didn't win. Holyfield took a unanimous decision. But Foreman showed the world that he belonged in the ring with the best fighters on the planet. At 42 years old, he'd gone the distance with one of the greatest champions in boxing history. The comeback was no longer a joke. It was real.
3 years later, on November 5, 1994, George Foreman stood in a Las Vegas ring across from Michael Moorer, the undefeated WBA and IBF heavyweight champion. Foreman was 45 years old. Everyone said he was too old, too slow, that this would be the end of the feel-good comeback story. For 9 rounds, they appeared to be right. Moorer dominated, landing punches at will, building an insurmountable lead on the scorecards. Foreman's corner was pleading with him to quit, to not take any more punishment, to end the fight before he got seriously hurt. But George Foreman wasn't thinking about quitting. He was thinking about Puerto Rico. He was thinking about the dressing room where he died.
He was thinking about the darkness and the void and the hand that had pulled him back to life. God hadn't saved him just so he could quit when things got hard.
In the 10th round, with less than 2 minutes remaining, Michael Moorer dropped his hands for a fraction of a second. George Foreman threw a short right hand that traveled maybe 8 inches. The punch landed perfectly on Moorer's chin, and Michael Moorer, the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, fell to the canvas. The referee counted to 10. The arena exploded. George Foreman, at 45 years old, 20 years after losing his title to Muhammad Ali, had knocked out the champion and become the oldest heavyweight champion in boxing history. When they put the championship belt around his waist, when the cameras flashed and the crowd roared, George Foreman looked up at the arena lights and said a simple prayer. Thank you.
Thank you for the second chance. Thank you for pulling me out of the darkness. Thank you for giving me purpose.
After the fight, in a quieter moment away from the cameras, someone asked Foreman if winning the championship was the greatest moment of his life. No, Foreman said without hesitation. The greatest moment of my life was dying in that dressing room in Puerto Rico and hearing God's voice tell me I was worth saving. Everything since then, the ministry, the youth center, the comeback, the championship, all of it is just me saying thank you for that moment. This belt? He pointed to the heavyweight championship. This is nice, but it's not why I'm here. I'm here because in 1977 I died and God brought me back. And when he brought me back, he gave me a mission. Help people, serve others.
Use your second chance to give other people second chances.
George Foreman defended his title once, then retired from boxing for good in 1997 at age 48. His final record was 76 wins and 5 losses, with 68 knockouts. But the numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is about a man who had everything, lost it all, found something greater than anything he'd ever had, and spent the rest of his life sharing it with others. The George Foreman grill made him wealthier than boxing ever did, earning him over $200 million. He used that money to expand his youth centers, to help at-risk kids, to support his church. He married his 5th wife, Mary Joan Martelli, in 1985, and that marriage lasted for the rest of his life. They raised 12 children together, including 5 sons, all named George.
When people asked why he named all his sons George, Foreman would explain with the same openness he brought to everything. I didn't know who my real father was until I was an adult. I never wanted my sons to have that confusion. If they're all named George, they'll always know who their father is. They'll always know they belong to me, and I belong to them. In his later years, Foreman became a beloved figure in American culture, known as much for his warmth and humor as for his boxing legacy. But people who knew him well, who heard him preach or worked with him at the youth center, they knew the real George Foreman, the man who died and come back, the man who'd seen the worst and been saved by the best.
The man who never forgot the voice that reached him in his darkest moment.
George Foreman passed away on March 21, 2025, at the age of 76. At his funeral, his pastor read from Foreman's own writings about that night in Puerto Rico in 1977. "I died that night, not metaphorically, not symbolically. I actually died. And in that death, I learned the most important truth of my life. We are never too far gone for God to reach us. We are never too lost for Him to find us. We are never too broken for Him to fix us. I was dead, and He brought me back. I was in darkness, and He pulled me into light. I was nothing, and He made me something. Not something the world values, like a champion or a celebrity. Something He values, a servant, a helper, a man who uses his second chance to give other people theirs."
If this story of death and resurrection, of darkness and light, of a voice that saved a dying man's life moves you, remember that second chances are real. Transformation is possible. No matter where you are, no matter what you've done, no matter how far you think you've fallen, you are not beyond saving. George Foreman proved that on March 17, 1977, when he died in a dressing room in Puerto Rico and came back a different man. The voice he heard in that darkness didn't just save his life, it gave him a reason to live. And for the next 48 years, George Foreman spent every day proving that the greatest victory isn't winning a championship. It's hearing the voice that calls you back from death and having the courage to answer.